thank you all for being here and joining in this conversation about planning and climate change. My name is Ariana Lindberg. I will be moderating this session that is really focused on conversations around land. I teach in landscape architecture, and I just wanted to introduce briefly our 4 panelists. We have 2 joining us remotely. So Stefan Pauleit is a professor at the Technical University of Munich and the chair for strategic landscape planning and management. So he is joining us from Germany today. Pam Zipsey is a New Jersey certified tree expert and the outreach coordinator for the Rutgers Urban Forestry Outreach Program. Frank Gallagher is the undergraduate program director in the Department of Environmental Planning at Rutgers University, and Amy Goldsmith is the New Jersey State Director of Clean Water Action. So I will turn this over to Stefan to begin the conversation.
Thank you very much, Ariana, for this introduction. I just get the message here that I can't share my screen. Okay, then I will use the slides that you have. So just okay. Thanks a lot. Yes. Thank you for inviting me to this talk, and thank you for all of you that are coming to listen to us and watch our presentations. So I will try in my talk to give you a little perspective from the kind of work that we are doing at my chair, to try to help local authorities in municipalities in Bavaria to adapt to climate change, and by using urban green infrastructure. So can you please move on to the next slide? Yes. So of course we are all aware of that. So that climate change is happening, and I don't need to talk too much about that. Temperatures will increase, probably also more or less rainfall depending on the region. But what is very important, of course, is that it's not only the general change that is going to happen, but also or already happening, but it's in particular the extreme events that are causing trouble. And maybe you are not aware of that, but in Germany, in the western part of Germany, we had some very serious flooding events in this summer, with causing a lot of casualties. 140 people or so about dying in big floodings. And in the past few years, we had also a lot of extreme events in terms of droughts, damaging our forests, and also the causing brownish parks and trees dying in cities. So this is really an increasing debate in Germany. And at the same time, of course, the big issue is how can we better integrate these climate adaptation concerns into urban planning. And this in particular, when at the same time, cities often are still growing. And so there is a need for more floor space for people living in the cities. This is the kind of tension that we are under. Next slide, please. Yeah, and the particular question that we are addressing in our studies is, can we adapt cities to climate change via green infrastructure? So the green spaces and maybe also the blue spaces that we find in cities. Of course, generally, there is quite a lot of evidence now in scientific literature that green can provide many ecosystem services like cooling, via transpiration or via shading, and rainwater retention and infiltration, and so forth. But to put this into practice, I think we need to know exactly how much green do we need, how should we design our open spaces, and overall the city at large to become more climate resilient. And with this in mind, in 2013, the Bavarian Ministry of the Environment and Climate and Consumer Protection started the Center for Urban Ecology and Climate Adaptation, which is now has grown from 1 project to 15 projects in total. So move on, please, to the next slide. And what we try to pursue here is a kind of integrated approach to climate change mitigation and adaptation, and also trying to integrate or create synergies with other concerns that we need to address in urban areas. And that is to enhance biodiversity and also to create synergies with this open space quality in urban areas, so that overall the quality of life in urban areas is enhanced. So that is what we try to do. And we try to inform local planners, local decision makers, how to do it in practice. Next slide, please. Yeah, and I just give you in the next few slides, for lack of time, I just give you a very rough overview of some of the approaches that we are following. And I will concentrate in this only on the, so to say, on the climate adaptation branch and looking at green infrastructure in particular. The question that we were trying to resolve in this project here is, how can we adapt typical neighborhoods in German cities, like perimeter blocks that you see to the top left, freestanding blocks of flats in the middle, and medieval town centers, whether and how can we adapt them to climate change with green infrastructure? And the approach that we were using is to work on case studies, as you can see to the left. And we used modeling approaches for modeling thermal comfort and for stormwater runoff modeling. And we tried to test the efficacy of different green infrastructure solutions, like planting more trees, greening the roofs, and greening the facades, and varying systematically the quantity of these different types of green infrastructure and where to place them in these different settlement types. And if you move on to the next slide, please. So this is just really to give you a little bit of an impression of how that looks like when you use such a kind of modeling approach. Here you can see 3 scenarios. On the left, for planting more trees in a neighborhood that where the tree cover or the overall green cover is below 10% today. So what would it mean to increase the surface cover of trees to 24%, which is still realistic in the sense that still traffic is possible in that area and other open space functions, or greening the roofs in the inner courtyard, or greening the facades around the buildings, in particular to the west and south-facing facades. Next slide. And we use these kind of modeling approaches. Here is a result from the maximum scenario when we apply NVMet, this microclimatic model, and we use as an output a thermal comfort index, which is called physiologically equivalent temperature. And we can test then the effect of these different green infrastructure types and quantities on thermal comfort. And one of the interesting results for us was that actually, yes, green infrastructure is effective in providing more thermal comfort in this area. So this is the situation of a hot summer day at 3 p.m. in the afternoon, when the situation is most uncomfortable usually. And as you can see, the effect is very different from these different green infrastructure types. However, so trees are cooling the environment quite nicely. This is at street level for pedestrians. Roof greening has almost no effect, and in 2050 in particular. And facade greening has also a quite strong effect, but it is spatially much more limited, as you can see from these yellow and orange colors. So the hotter, the more red the colors. So you can see, if you compare left to right, that trees have the biggest effect, of course, due to shading. And if you plant them in strategic locations like open squares, street crossings, in front of sun-exposed facades, then the effect will be best. Next slide, please. And here you can see as a summary figure some of the modeling results that we produced. So under current climate and under future climate conditions, we use 2050 as a reference because that is still something that one has in sight as a planner, even if it's also already quite long term. And as a conclusion of that, move on to the next slide. Please, yes, thank you. We use this as a kind of input by employing landscape architects and ecologists to further qualify these kind of green infrastructure types and start to detail planting regimes in the different settlement types, and adding further concerns like stormwater infiltration to this, and the use of the open spaces. And as a result of that, if you please move on to the next slide, we arrived kind of test designs that you can see here for the same neighborhood. So now it's a green neighborhood. You see a lot new trees planted, both in the backyard and in the streets, and all other measures like roof greening mainly for stormwater retention. And so two things have been combined. And also we added quite a lot of detail to the tree species that we would use also to be more robust under drought conditions, but also to enhance biodiversity and further concerns. And all of this has been summarized in a guidance where, say, for this area, we made 13 points, 13 suggestions that planners might pick up, or landscape architects might pick up, to adapt such neighborhoods to climate change. And this looks just nice. It's just colors that you can see here, but actually it had quite an effect. First, the numbers were quite important to designers. So now they had a hard figure in hand in that we told them that they should increase the green space amount to 20-25% in this area by providing details how to do it, as you can see here on the map. And so this has become quite a reference to them for trying to discuss that or integrate it into their own design. And we went also further on in our study and also looked in detail at planning instruments and what kind of instruments can be used for making this happen. Next slide, please. These are just some key challenges by which I want to summarize my talk. If I say that by adding 10 to 15% of green to the surface area, this may not look so dramatic, even in a densely built neighborhood like this one, but in fact it is, because it will mean that we will have I would say, complete transformation of the open space. We need to change to shared and multifunctional public spaces if we want to make this happen. We need to reduce mobility, both in terms of the running mobility, but also in parking cars. And that would be a dramatic change in such a city. Next slide, please. But we are also in particular concerned about the underground infrastructures, because trees cannot grow if they don't get water and if they don't have the rooting space available. And almost the entire space, as it is at the moment, is already used for utility lines. So this will be a big challenge for the transformation of such places. Next slide, please. And we need to scale. We used a single block for doing our studies, because that was the one which is really this kind of scale, which is really tangible for landscape architects, for urban planners. But we need to translate this into concepts for the entire city or for the neighborhood. And finally, next slide, please. All of this will mean that we need planning approaches that are collaborative and that are engaging with the people. Collaborative, by that I mean in particular that we need to engage with different disciplines in the planning realm, so with the engineers, with urban planners, with landscape architects, and also with the sciences behind that, because transforming urban spaces cannot be done by one discipline alone. I think that became clear already from the preceding slides. And it means also, not least for the reason that 80% of the city is in the hands of private landowners, that we need to strongly engage with the public. But there are, of course, also other reasons that one should mention here, and that is that simply the people need to be engaged to find out what kind of spaces they want and need. And next slide, please. Yeah, some conclusions, and I hope I didn't take my time too much here. Well, the first one is as a kind of message: transforming cities via urban green infrastructure is a key to climate protection, and in particular to climate change adaptation. We have the numbers for that, and we can show how to do it. I did not talk too much about densification that is happening at the same time, but we did further studies where we tested out also how that can be combined. And as a conclusion, I would say that to effectively integrate diverse and multifunctional green spaces into densifying neighborhoods, one needs to try to work on different issues at the same time, try to create synergies between climate change adaptation, biodiversity, and open space quality. So things that are maybe further in the distance in the future, like climate change, but try to combine it with things, with issues that are of immediate value to the people living in the area, and also to decision makers, like open space quality and quality of life in general. In Germany, and that may be interesting for the later discussion, we have a lot of instruments, planning instruments, regulations, etc., that may be used aggressively or should be used aggressively to make climate change happen. And what we realize is that these instruments should be used in combination, and which requires the skills for the planners to do that, but also they are at the moment, the potential to use these instruments for climate change adaptation are underused, underutilized. And that is so because on the one hand, maybe planners are not yet fully aware of how to use them, but also because generally still the pressure to implement climate change adaptation measures is not strong enough yet. So this needs the awareness that this is really necessary needs to be increased still. And this kind of collaborative working between the different departments in the city needs to be strengthened. I think that these might be two main points here. And fourth, what we found out in our studies is the sooner that you begin in trying to mainstream climate change adaptation into planning routines and instruments, the better the chances for success. That sounds logic, of course, but it's quite a challenge ahead. So we need to start as soon as possible at phase 0, so to say, of the planning process, and not when everything else has already been decided upon. And as said before, cooperation and participation are success factors. So thank you very much for your attention. Looking forward later to the discussion.
Hi, everyone. Watch my time. Hi. So I feel really honored to be included on this panel and to be part of this conference. And I wanted to just start by saying I really believe in urban forests and in the good that trees and forests can do in cities and towns. And so I'm really excited to see that we're talking about this at this Climate Bridge conference. And so we know that trees store and sequester carbon, and that's why they're an important part of the climate change discussion. And I think what makes trees such an intriguing tool in that toolbox, because it'll take more than trees, obviously. We've heard a lot of really great and complex plans and tools and structures to work together to deal with our climate change future. I think what makes trees so intriguing there is the volume of co-benefits that we get from trees in cities, in addition to just the carbon storage and sequestration. So trees will also, as Stefan was talking about, they just can lower the temperatures and make the cities more livable and make life more pleasant, right? They're pretty to look at and they cool you down, and that's a good thing. And then they are also mitigating stormwater, right? They can help to slow down the flow of water. They help with infiltration of water into the soil, and can help to clean our water as well. Same with air, they're mitigating air pollution. And when they're planted strategically and thoughtfully, they also can help to reduce energy usage in our cities, right? Either through a windbreak to make it easier to heat your home in the winter, or as shade to make it easier to cool your home in the summer. And so that can reduce carbon emissions into the atmosphere, in addition to the carbon that the trees themselves are taking out of the atmosphere. So many co-benefits. And then of course, the people are in the cities and the towns, and we need to have trees where people are so that people can derive those direct benefits. So urban forests are good. The project that I wanted to tell you about is called the Cool Cities Initiative. And this happened back in the early 2000s. The New Jersey Forest Service partnered with the New Jersey Board of Public Utilities to plant tens of thousands of trees in dozens of cities across New Jersey with the goals of mitigating the urban heat island effect and reducing energy costs for the residents in those cities. And so the current urban forestry coordinator at the Forest Service in New Jersey wanted to kind of go into those files from that project that happened, almost 20 years ago now, and had kind of been, finished and put away. She wanted to kind of go through and look at, find what they could from the records and go back and find those trees and see how they're doing and see if the goals have been met. And so worked with our urban forestry program at Rutgers to bring on some interns to dive into that project. And so that's what we're talking about, the experience of those interns that I worked with over the summer to look at the Cool Cities project, in this case, 18 years later. And so that first picture there is our day in the field. We spent a lot of what we're doing over the summer was remote, and a lot of time was spent trying to figure out the old files and find the data. But we had this one glorious day in the field where we went and found some of those trees. And I think that first picture really captures that moment where we got there and we were like, where are the trees? And it took a while to realize that those huge trees were the Cool Cities trees. We were looking for little trees and they weren't all that big. This is elm, it's a quick growing species, but those are the trees. And we just were like, these are the trees, wow. You know that saying, the best time to plant a tree is 20 years ago? This is it. It's so true, because it was just amazing. And that excitement of they're here and they're doing the thing. And then that second picture I thought was also a really cool moment, because the one tree was dead. I don't know if you can really see it. It's kind of behind the truck, and it's just the trunk is there. The top has been removed. And so we decided to measure that tree as well, because part of it was still there. And we kind of just took this moment of, it's really hot here, and we're like 2 or 3 blocks in, and we had been in the shade of these big, beautiful elm trees. And then in this one spot where the canopy wasn't there, it was hot and uncomfortable. And this was August, and it was getting to be late morning and the sun was cooking, and we felt it. And that was another like, wow, this is what the trees are doing. We didn't have good data yet. We're in the infancy of the data collection that needs to happen to have any data to report on this, but we could feel the impact, right? From just kind of standing where there was one tree that had died and then moving back into the shade of the ones that were there. So I thought that was really cool. And so, we were there trying to measure impact, and we're trying to figure out how to measure the impact from this project. And, whether we can do that remotely using, modeling programs, whether we have to go to each tree and look at it, how we're going to do that. But in addition to the measuring, something that we realized when we were standing in that shade was that we had spent the whole summer thinking about these trees as numbers on a list, right? And dots on a map. And then we were standing in the shade of them and it became really real. And so, we wanted to kind of think about, while we don't have a measured impact to report on, we do have an experienced impact, that those trees are doing something in that city. And presumably, hopefully, in all the other cities too. So we thought that was pretty cool. And at least in that way, those trees are accomplishing that goal. There's a lot more research to be done to figure out, a cost benefit analysis of the planting versus the, energy savings that's happening happening. There's a lot of work to be done there, but we could feel that something is happening. You can see in that first picture the shade that tree is throwing on that sidewalk, and then on the stoop, right? You could sit on the stoop in the shade. It's shading the windows of those buildings. It's shading that air conditioning unit in the second picture. That was what this project was about, right? To shade the air conditioning units and reduce the energy costs. So in the one way you can see that it's happening. Another really great moment from that field experience was we were also taking pictures of the trees at DBH at 4.5 feet above the ground. We were trying to put a little index card right at 4.5 feet and take a picture from 2 directions. And one of the interns commented, like, it's so frustrating that there's always a car in the way when I'm trying to take these pictures. And we're walking down the street and there's no cars where there aren't any trees, and then have to get these pictures and there's a car in the way. And then just right as she was kind of thinking out loud and talking out loud, oh, they're parking in the shade. The people are parking in the shade, right? And that's exactly what we were trying to do. I talk about we, like I planted those trees and I didn't, but that's what the project was about, right? That's what we in general are trying to do when we're putting trees in cities, to make them more livable. We're doing all these other great co-benefits. Climate change is important, but livability in the city is important too. And from that perspective, I feel like we have, the early inklings of success, but we need to measure it. So I think I mentioned we tried to do some measurements remotely, right, using computer programming. The initial project managers ran some test areas in the cities through a project or a program that was called City Green to project the energy savings and the canopy enclosure that they thought would happen from these plantings. We tried to compare that to the, City Green was the predecessor of iTree, which is the current software program that we have from the U.S. Forest Service and Davy Resource Group that provides, analysis of the dollar value of the benefits provided by trees. And it didn't really work so well. They didn't match up well because it's different programs and it needs more work. And then we did measure a small amount of trees. You can see in that map there, that's a map of Trenton, which was one of the dozens of cities that was planted. And there are 4 planting areas in Trenton. And we looked at a very, very small section of one of the planting areas. That one planting area that we did go to visit, though, we chose that one because it is also a CSO community where we have those trees not only, sequestering and storing carbon and shading, but managing stormwater. So that's why we went there to look there. And we have a very small subset, and it wasn't worth reporting on, the findings, because it's not enough to tell you anything. But what it did tell us was what kind of data we need to collect. And, from running that little piece of the report and getting back, this is what we can tell you, and this is what we can't. We know that if we really want to dig into that energy savings and see if it met the goals and if we're really saving people money, that's worth the cost of planting the trees, we're going to have to measure the distance and direction of those trees from those window air conditioning units. And that's a lot of data collection, but that's forthcoming. There's a graduate student already signed on to it, so we will get there. And, as far as cultivating those partnerships, I think first and foremost, it's amazing that the New Jersey Forest Service did this in partnership with the Board of Public Utilities. Because usually you think about, trees in cities and the energy infrastructure as kind of being at odds with each other. But this was a really great partnership, and I think one that could be repeated if we can prove that it worked, which I think that it did. I hope that it did when we get some data behind it. I also am really grateful for the partnership between the Forest Service and the university that provides funding and projects like this for our students to get these internships and get these opportunities to go out and be part of these larger, longer lasting projects, which is a really great lesson in itself for forestry, that, you don't start and finish a project most of the time in forestry. You inherit the project from the forester before you and pass it on to the one who comes after, because trees take time. But there's all these other opportunities for collaborations with the tree planting contractors and the forestry professionals, but also the concrete cutters and Stefan was talking about, worrying about what's going on underground. And we saw in some of those other pictures, that picture right there, you can see that the sidewalk is buckling, right? There are other problems, challenges that go along with it. And so we have opportunities to do our tree plantings better. And, hopefully collecting this research and building more partnerships will help us to think about, the underground piece of this. And can we use structural soils to make more space for the trees to grow bigger, but then also not break the sidewalks and that kind of thing. So there's so much, tremendous opportunity. And even for, informing the residents about what we're doing and bringing Shade Tree Commission volunteers and shop owners and getting everybody kind of involved and on the same page and recognizing the good that trees are doing. So that's what I wanted to talk about, and just, kind of acknowledge the thanks that we have for the involvement with the New Jersey Forest Service and the work that they do and the internships that they provide. And Mike Martini took most of those pictures, and Emily Farsham from the Forest Service gathered a lot of the information, kind of dug through their records, because none of the people on that list were there when the project was happening. So it was hard to find all that. And just as a point of fact, Mike and Emily are both Rutgers graduates who both interned with the Forest Service that turned into full-time jobs. So that is another cool kind of co-benefit of working with trees. The interns were Eva Pop, Sarah Falk, and Caitlin Spina, and of course, Dr. Grabowski, who leads our program. And thank you.
Just getting old. I don't want to fall down. Okay. Well, thank you folks for coming to the session today. My name is Frank Gallagher. I'm with Rutgers here at the university. So I grew up in an urban area here in the Jersey City Bayonne Peninsula. And I had the just fortunate happenstance of being born in the 50s and growing up in the 60s when the Industrial Revolution was waning. And during that period, the waterfront, of course, had been used by the Industrial Revolution, and access to the waterfront was actually absolutely prohibited. But because of the sort of closure of the Industrial Revolution, it was pretty easy to sneak into those areas to get to the waterfront. And for us growing up, what I should call juvenile delinquents, growing up, the idea of swimming across the harbor proved several things. One, that we were strong enough to make it. Two, that we knew the difference between incoming and outgoing tides, because that could be a problem. And three, that we were dumb enough to be teenagers. Okay, and fortunately, I didn't know anybody who didn't make it. But I think on a deeper level, we were searching for something more heavy, searching for that ecological identity, searching for where Shel Silverstein wrote in his kids' books, where the sidewalk ends. And so somehow I got into that as a kid, and I never got out of it. And after several decades of land management through the Division of Parks and Forestry, and now a couple decades of academia, I've been working on this sort of urban green space issue for a long time. And fortunately for me, maybe a little late, but towards the end of my career, it's come into vogue, and the idea that green space in urban areas is important, not only from a social perspective, but also to address climate change. And so I'd like to talk a little bit about two sites that I think illustrate some of the potentials, but also some of the issues that exist in sort of the policy and regulatory framework that guides our development in these brownfields and used spaces. So the photograph on the right there is the two sites I'll talk about, Liberty State Park and the Bayonne Golf Course. And then the photographs on the left are from the Manhattan Project to really give you an idea of the difference between what these landscapes may have looked like several hundred years ago and what they look like today. The brown area on the Bayonne and Jersey City Peninsula actually demonstrates how much of that area is fill material. Over 50% of the land in the Jersey City and Bayonne Peninsula is created land. It's anthropogenic soils. It's just fill material. And so there's a whole new way of looking at the urban ecology if you think about it growing from soils that were created and are totally heterogeneous. They come from all over the place. And so at Liberty State Park, we've been looking at that for ages, since the site originally was a railroad. And I remember we used the railroads as a kid. I remember going on the railroad to the subways to get over the 63 World Fair. And that's how we got around. But of course, after 100 years of use, the railroads left some materials, I'll call them, behind, right? And today, most of it is a beautiful park, and maybe some of you have been there, but there are about 100 hectares in the middle of that park that are undeveloped. And that's where the real controversy actually starts. I always give students in my class extra credit if they can name the movie from which the top photograph was taken. Anybody want to take a shot at it? Famous movie. Of course, was filmed in the 60s. You can find it on YouTube. Okay. And here's a hint. Leave the gun, take the cannolis. Godfather, right, good job. That scene was filmed at what today is Liberty State Park, and the photograph on the bottom actually represents, it's a little bit further away, but it represents what that has turned into. And what amazed me going back to work there in about 1983 and 84 was not, because I had worked there earlier in the 70s at the docks themselves, was how much that sort of invasive species of Phragmites and Artemisia, how much the trees had just taken over. And I said, what's going on here? These are contaminated soils, and yet the ecology seems to be somewhat robust. So we spent the next 25 years or so really examining that issue and looking at, number one, how the soils were constructed. In this place, they're fairly homogeneous. It's basically bay fill, right? Bay dredge materials. And then on top of that, you have cinder and ash put down by the railroads. On top of that, you have some gravel that was put down for the railroad tracks. And then on top of that, you see the last 20 to 40 years of after the railroads pulled out, pedogenesis. You actually see soil forming. And so the question was, what's going on here? Because if we looked at, the chemistry, it says, well, there's a lot of contaminated areas, and those white spots on that map were saying, hey, listen, these areas are hotter when you look at basically metal load than the other areas. But growing on top of that stuff, boy, these plants look good. So what do the plants know that we don't know? Right? So it's taken us a good 20 years or so to actually study that issue. And what we came up was that, hey, it's not just contaminant, no plants. Contaminant basically resulting in a metabolic degradation. There are threshold values and there are nonlinear relationships. And the plants that actually grow there are adapted to these soils. They've been there long enough. They've been doing it for 60, 70 years now. Okay, and so then we asked the questions about, well, what does that mean in terms of risk? And how do the contaminants move? It's not that the contaminants aren't there, it's that the contaminants are somewhat stable and they're not being translocated. And they're not, unless you eat the soil, they're not getting into humans. So the risk factor is fairly low. And we looked about facilitation and competition between species, what it looks like over time, what the trajectories of the plant communities look like. And what we found and what we believe is that there's a really unique urban ecology that has an identity all of its own. And it doesn't follow traditional trajectories. It doesn't follow traditional community assemblage rules that we've learned here at Rutgers for 30, 40 years, but it has this sort of own uniqueness. And fortunately for this site, since it was the subject of litigation, we also had a consent decree issue that said, hey, you know what? You guys have proven to us that the risk isn't that great. And so even though the regulatory and statutes require you to actually cover these soils up and cap it all, in this case, we're going to push that envelope. And like several speakers before me were talking about, we have to see where that envelope can go because the rules haven't really been written for this. And so we hired a firm, Margaret Ruddick. In fact, if some of you saw Pippa Brascia, she was actually one of the landscape architects on this project. She was at our last session. And we, instead of saying, come in here and this is a new canvas, we're saying, we have a unique unique urban ecology here. Let's see how we can work with that urban ecology. And so that's the landscape plan that was actually developed, where over half of the site would remain, even though it was, historic fill, it would remain in its original condition. And we would actually work with it over time, seeing how we can improve diversity and seeing how we can improve productivity within those natural urban assemblages. So one way to do that was, rather than coming in with, a big shovel, come in with a scalpel and really look at your interventions, your paths, and your gathering areas, and how many people there were there, and then try to integrate your planting plans so that they actually fold into what had developed there as urban ecology. And by doing that, increasing diversity and increasing plant productivity. And so that was the original plan. And we finished all that up sometime in around 2008. And you might recognize that 2008, 2016, and 2020, they're all election years, right? And so things changed. In 2008, things changed pretty interestingly. There wasn't a lot of money being spent at that time during that administration, the Christie administration, on natural resources. It just wasn't happening. So even though we had allocated over $11 million that was in the bank to start the project never went anywhere. So the next administration, Murphy administration, comes along, and they have no history. There was no connection to the project, right? And so they start a whole new process, and they look at the whole issue, and they take all of our data and say, you know what, that's not what the regulatory framework calls for. That's outside the regulatory framework, and we can't do that. And so now we have a plan that looks something like this, where it follows the same sort of philosophy. There's the same elements to that. However, what's really different, two things are really different. One thing is they're going for an active recreation area, okay, which will, change the overall landscape somewhat. But in addition to that, they're going to cap the entire site first, okay, which raises the elevation at least a foot, if not several feet in some places, decreases the flood storage capacity. And by doing that, our studies had shown that it was between 40,000 kilograms of carbon stored in just the above ground material per hectare. And there's about 100 hectares. So basically you're taking about 4 to somewhere around 8 million kilograms of carbon, and you're putting that back in the atmosphere, because you're basically taking that woody material out. So here's one of those sort of the confluence of risk aversion and existing regulations really need to be examined in the context of climate change. The second project I'll talk a little bit about is another one of those that has these conflict points. And this happens to be the Bayonne Golf Course, just a mile or so down the shoreline from Liberty State Park. And here, it was really interesting in that the developers of the Bayonne Golf Course, which is on top of what originally was an oil refinery site. It goes back to Rockefeller. He was the original developer of that site. And so Exxon and Esso and all those companies lived there for a while. And so the site's contaminated. They brought in a bunch of beneficial reused dredge material to build up the golf course and cap over the whole site. But they built it in an area, of course, that is tidal, right? The area is on shoreline itself. And what's unique about this site is that in most cases, when you talk about tidal lands, the property boundaries generally end at the high tide mark. But in this case, because it's got such a long history, the tidal properties were actually transferred in the deed. So that tidal property is actually of private ownership, which is really unusual in most of New Jersey. And so the owner of this says, hey, there's a lot of good stuff going on. If you looked at the Breakwater project over in Staten Island, there's a lot of good stuff going on that can protect this site from future storm surge. And so we got together with those folks, folks from Rutgers here and folks from Stevens Institute of Technology. And we really examined what the storm surge issues would be, what the flow patterns would be. And we had basically been given a charge by the owner, who by the way, great guy. His name is Don, but he could have been in that movie I showed you earlier. He's an old Italian lawyer that he fit right into the whole picture. but he invited us up to the golf club, which is a really beautiful place. And I know the students who are involved in the project, they go up there and they sit down and they would ask, well, what do you want? Here's the menu. You know, it's lobster. It's, oh my God, the students have gone crazy. But so we came up with a couple of plans that actually included these sort of breakwater islands that would be placed in front of the golf course itself and help protect from the storm surge both the golf course and the residential settings that's behind the golf course on Route 440 there. And so this is another interesting case where the regulatory framework basically says you can't do that because you're filling in wetlands, right? So it's really against the law to fill in wetlands. And in this case, even though the wetlands are mudflats and tidal mudflats, it still has a sort of a regulatory issue. But in this case, because I think the benefits are really obvious and the storm surge protection is so obvious, the regulatory community is actually beginning to look at it. Doesn't happen quickly. And in fact, it's been 2 years since we've even talked to the regulatory folks, and it's still going through the process of review. But they have agreed to actually bring us back at some point to consider the project and to consider if we can get sort of a waiver from some of the restrictions of the wetlands provisions in order to say, you know, this project not only will protect the shorefront from storm surge, but also it has the added ecological benefit of creating more salt marsh, of creating more upland and tidal habitat, and actually on top of it, bringing some fresh water in and really diversifying the system. So the ecological benefits, although they are hard to monetize, we know how much it'll cost, but we don't know what the long-term return on that investment will be. Just the qualitative value of those benefits is actually having some weight, and hopefully in who knows, maybe several years or something like that, but these types of projects will see the green light more often. So that's a little bit about my presentation. And at this time, the bottom line is, you know, working in these sort of developed and urban settings, the idea that we come up against brick walls all the time is not new, but the idea there is so much potential there to create something that's unique and that may not look like what we saw 100 years ago, but it certainly will function that way. And I think that's where the shift has to come. It's not about what it looks like, it's more about how it functions. Okay, and then I'd like to, well, those are my contact information and some funny words, but I'd like to introduce Amy Goldsmith, right?
Well, hi, everyone. I know some of you are virtual and some of you are, looks like you're sitting on kind of comfy chairs there over at Rutgers. My daughter's in her final year at Rutgers in the soils program over at Cook College. So I've spent some time over there. And I'm Amy Goldsmith. I'm the New Jersey State Director for Clean Water Action and Clean Water Fund. And, you know, you've heard a lot all day, and I'm sort of the last person you want to hear from before you hit Route 18 and the traffic. So see if we can spin this up a little bit and get right to a dynamic conversation. So, you know, we all know with climate change, we can't always know what's coming, and that we're intensity. We've heard that over and over again. And this reality, we also know is going to happen more and be more and more true. And I'm going to speak more from the perspectives. You've heard earlier speakers talk about the environmental injustices that happen on a daily basis. And certainly when we have not just extreme weather, but routine flash rains in our neighborhoods. And my colleague, Kim Gaddy, who's our environmental justice director and fourth generation Newarker, couldn't be here today, but I've worked with her for over 20 years in the streets of Newark, and now we're doing a new initiative in Trenton. So I'm going to talk about both of those things in my conversation today with you. You know, people in communities that are largely Black, brown, low income are overburdened, under-resourced, they're less resilient, not because they personally are less resilient. They're incredibly resilient because they put up with all of this, but they don't have the buffers and the mechanisms in their communities that others who have more privilege and have more resources do. Although Hurricane Ida sort of defied all of that a month or so ago, in that many people experienced the travesty and the hardship of extreme climate change. And so the waves of heat and the floods do affect different communities differently. And, as you've heard over and over again, cities, often lack trees. People don't have air conditioners. They don't have access to food, healthy food, culturally oriented food in their neighborhoods. And so, and also they don't always have, as you've heard from some other speakers, not necessarily just in this session, but other sessions, don't have access to decision makers. They don't, or they're not getting responses from their decision makers. Although in some cases, the virtual platform has made some things more accessible due to COVID, because people can use, well, they might not have a computer, they might have a smartphone that they can gain access to something that's happening virtually, where in the past they hadn't been able to. So we should make sure that we use, some of the good tools that we've had to develop over time, as we're doing with this conference, to be flexible and to do hybrids. So we want to make sure that people are actually in the room, as has been said before, and in other sessions. In particular, I want to talk about Newark and sort of some things that have happened in Newark that has been in some ways game-changing, and some just really pointing to the realities of cities like Newark. People who get flooded and overheated, in cities like Newark, have no place to go. They may not even have a car to get into to go someplace else. They have to be in that place, to its benefits and to its hardships. And basements are backing up routinely. And you heard from a speaker about the Passaic Valley Sewer Commission and their frack gas plant. I just want you to know that we're opposed to that frack gas plant. But the PVSC plant is in Newark, in an environmental justice community. It is at the end of the line of 48 municipalities, and Newark gets the brunt of the backups. And when a big storm hits and they don't have capacity, they close off some of their pipes. And that means that people who are closer to the end of the line, like Newark, get the backup of sewage in their basements. And when Hurricane Sandy hit, there were 3 weeks of no treatment at that facility. And who got the stench and who got the hardship? It was the people in the city of Newark. So we see this all the time, even with these sort of sunny weather events. And it means that people's homes, their land, their yards, their parks, their playgrounds get inundated with water and create harm, because these cities are all industrial cities. And as was mentioned before, a lot of these places, these homes, are built on top of industrial zones, industrial property. And when Hurricane Sandy hit, when the tsunami of water went up the Passaic River and into the Ironbound neighborhood, it brought with it the toxic chemicals of the chemical corridor and the factories and the facilities that were lining the river, and ended up in people's basements. So we're not just talking about water, we're not just talking about stormwater, we're also talking about the toxics that come with it, and the cumulative harms and the cumulative impacts. But also, as was discussed before, the multiple benefits that can happen by doing green infrastructure and other things. It creates economic wealth, it creates health, improvements to the neighborhood in ways that enhance the neighborhood. And it also includes, we haven't really talked about this, but it also trees, greenery, gardens, bioswales, they all provide some calming effect. You know, we know that on a hot summer day, people get hot under the collar, but if we actually cooled the neighborhood, literally, we might calm people and their tempers, what people do. And so those all have positive benefits that we don't talk about as much. And the other is that it provides social cohesion. You know, if you're growing a garden with your neighbors, you know, you feel neighborly. And that has an incredible benefit. Or if you're collectively making sure that the trees stay alive on your street, or you're doing what they do in Newark, where they actually adopt a catch basin and make sure the catch basins are free of debris, you know, both businesses, community, residents, students, then everybody's contributing to a social good. And all of that, that social cohesion is incredibly powerful, and we shouldn't ignore that. And also the fact that, and it was mentioned earlier, that the more planning, the more things that we do, the more planting of trees, whatever it is that we do, and the decisions get made, like at Liberty State Park with Sam Pesson and his family, who have, you know, been champions of that park for decades and for generations. The more the community decides and drives the agenda, what gets done, how the decisions are made, the more those things are going to be long lasting and stewarded and taken care of. And also, when things aren't going quite right, how do you then rectify or troubleshoot and get remedies to that? So a few things that I want to mention specifically that are being done in Newark. Several years back, cities and towns cities that have combined sewer overflows that have been long in violation of the Federal Clean Water Act were required under court order to come up with long-term control plans. And Newark was one of those cities. And Newark developed what they call Newark DIG, doing infrastructure green. It's many different people at the table, including my organization, Clean Water Action. And they developed strategies to do both pilot programs on green infrastructure, but also to redesign the long-term control plans so that it has the community in mind and it has green infrastructure in mind. And Stefan was saying we should have 10 to 15% green infrastructure. You know, these long-term control plans barely have 5, you know, and they think that that's revolutionary. We need to really crank this up, right? Because of all the multiple benefits that we can get. And Newark DIG worked with community people and created green infrastructure reformers and water ambassadors. They actually trained people in the community to go door to door to talk about green infrastructure and the importance of it, because nobody knew what the heck this stuff was and why it was valuable, and to get community groups and individuals more engaged, understanding why it was important, why they should join the Adopt a Catch Basin program, why they should maintain the catch basins. And there is also another element to this, in addition to the fact that they were under court order to do this. They got community people involved through canvassing and other things. They also worked to make sure that people in the community got trained to actually do the green infrastructure. So there were certification programs. Kim Gaddy's on my staff. She got certification. The National Green Infrastructure Certification Program, Rutgers has certification programs. And so a lot of what we and our partners and allies really have been trying to move is that we want to build our cities back and build them better, be more resilient, be ready for the future and for the climate change ahead as best we can. But we want Newarkers, who are largely left out and left behind of any economy, to be part of the growing green and emerging economy, whether it's renewables or green infrastructure. And so there's been a heavy emphasis on using workforce development programs and other programs to make this happen. And the city has actually is all about jobs. They want people to be working. You have people working, they're off the street, not getting into trouble, bringing community wealth into the community by working. And so why not do something good for the community and get paid for it? Family supporting jobs, union jobs in some cases. And the other piece that the city is doing, talked a little about pavement, pavement and impervious cover. And there's been some efforts underway. Newark, like most cities, is probably 75%, if not more, impervious cover. We need to start ripping up some of this impervious cover, or using permeable pavements, or making the people who are building parking lots and things like that to pay their fair share towards the green infrastructure that we need, whether it's permeable pavements, holding tanks to release the water later. Also talking with churches and schools who also have parking lots and a lot of pavement to be part of that capture and slow release that we need. And of course, there's been conversations, not in this workshop as much, but in other workshops, about urban gardens, healthy food, water storage, cooling, the social cohesion benefits that we get, and also putting vacant lots to use. Even though sometimes they get captured back by the city for development, some of these have really become cultural centers for neighborhoods, and really great stuff. My organization worked to actually help a local church that does job employment work. They dismantled wooden pallets, and made picket fences. And they made kiosks, and then we made structures to raise up rain barrel systems so that we could capture, water off the nearby roof, so that we could be watering, the flowers and the gardens. So all of this working together created social cohesion in ways that we just never anticipated. So that's some of the work that we've done in Newark, and some of that work is very local. It was mentioned, how do you go from pilot to scale? There's been some pilot projects that have been talked about for the last 3 years. The money is sitting there and we still can't get it out of the gate. So there's a very big challenge of going from, we're in a climate emergency, we're in code red. How do we move from, little pilots to getting to scale, whether it's in a neighborhood or, a citywide? I think there's much more interest in many more cities, not just in New Jersey, but all around the country to do this, but we have to do it faster, ever faster, and a much bigger scale. And so now I'm going to shift in my remaining time to a project that's just getting underway in Trenton. And, we heard about the tree planting project. The effort that Clean Water Action is doing in partnership with Delaware River Network is one that we're calling an upstream downstream initiative. And in Mercer County, which is near the Trenton area, it's a little bit north of Camden and Philadelphia, if you don't know the geography that well, or if you know the map of New Jersey, it's kind of where the waste of the state comes together and gets sucked in, and it's on the Delaware River. And, people don't really think about Newark, not Newark, New Jersey as, surrounded by water, but in fact, New Jersey is a peninsula. If you actually look at the map, we are completely on all sides, except for the very top, which is New York. We have the Delaware River, we have the Atlantic Ocean, we have the Delaware Bay. The entire state is, except for the top, is surrounded by water. And Trenton, in essence, is a coastal town, and it floods all the time. And it particularly floods because the upstream suburban communities, predominantly white, like Hamilton and Robbinsville, have developed. They're building warehouses. They have sprawl, box stores. They've built a lot on these watersheds, like the Asapink watershed. And that watershed and that water goes downstream. And where does it go? It goes to Trenton. If you've ever been to Trenton on a really bad rain or bad storm like Ida, the Trenton train station floods out, and Amtrak goes through that station. And during Ida, my son actually got trapped in Baltimore because he couldn't get past Philadelphia because the train station was flooded out. That means that the neighborhood nearby is also flooded out. So what we're planning to do over the next 18 months is actually connect people who care about the flooding. And there is flooding in Hamilton. You know, it's not that they're free of flooding, but to connect the people in Hamilton and the zoning board and the environmental commissions in Hamilton with those in Trenton, and to also connect the neighborhoods and the residences in those upstream, downstream communities. And we're actually going to be doing tours in each of their neighborhoods to show where the impacts are and to sort of make this more real. You know, everybody says, oh yeah, you know, they got flooded, that was really bad, but you know, they didn't experience it. Well, if you're actually in somebody's neighborhood and you get to know that neighborhood, you actually might have more reason to care about that neighborhood. So we're going to be doing sort of an exchange touring program. We're going to teach people how to use zoning law, how to publicly speak in front of the zoning board, who makes the decisions, and what kind of solutions do each of these towns want, and to identify those decision makers and then engage with them. And so this is both an awareness around the problem and solutions that we seek, but it's also about empowering people, whether you're in the suburbs or in an environmental justice, very diverse, multilingual community like Trenton, to empower people to actually get the change that they seek. No one should have to live with streets that are impassable, basements that are flooded. Nobody should have to live with that. And so, and it's only going to get worse in a climate changing world. So now's the time, as we decide to use very valuable and scarce resources and make policies to keep escalating what our response is going to be, or to mitigate and adapt. We need to make sure that we have communities like Trenton, like Newark, like Patterson and others, Perth Amboy in New Jersey, to be able to speak for themselves and to get the changes and priorities straight for those neighborhoods. So I'm going to stop there because I know we have some time for Q&A, but I just wanted to bring that perspective to the table to round out the other great speakers that were here in this panel.
So thank you all so much for starting us off on a really interesting conversation, sharing your work. We have an extra mic. So we have about 15 minutes remaining in this session. And as the moderator, I get to kind of start off the conversation. But then I'd like to open it up to both our audience here at Rutgers, and then also if you have any questions to actually put in the chat, I will keep an eye on that. So what I found particularly intriguing in all four of these presentations was something that I think Amy really addressed more so in this last presentation, and about this importance of social cohesion. And Stefan, at I believe it was on your last slide, you spoke to how cooperation and participation are success factors. And so even though this panel is titled Land, I really want to bring in the people aspect in terms of really understanding how each of you kind of managed to bring the people into these projects, right? So that piece of community engagement that is so important to a much more resilient and effective long-term solution. So,
sure. Let me just give a quick analogy here. The idea that the support for the redevelopment of the interior section of Liberty State Park had a huge public support beginning in the late 90s and right through the early 2000s. And in fact, we had one public meeting where we had 700 participants show up to the Liberty Science Center, whose auditorium only held 350. And so at that one, at that one, it was a little contentious. So we did have rangers up in front because there were some people who, you know, they throw things at Jersey City. You know? But the point here is that 15 years later, the constituents have changed. And the public support that existed 20 years ago is no longer there. And it's not there because there wasn't a sustained effort to actually keep it there. And so this idea that the public, you have to get public support, yes, but it's not a one-shot deal. It's basically a continuous part of the project, of the process.
So from the perspective of a local tree planting, we know, and I've worked for the State Forest Service before coming to Rutgers, and I also work with the nonprofit, the New Jersey Tree Foundation, that plants trees in cities. And we know that the trees do better, the projects run more smoothly when the community is involved. It's not right. Not only does it not work, but it's just not right to just kind of go into a place and say, I'm putting a tree here, and I don't care whether you like it or not, right? You have to work with the people who will, live with that tree. And, that tree will have success if the people are on board and understand the benefits of it and want the tree and sign on to taking care of it. So we know that the community building part of a tree planting is critical to the success. And then we also know that it does help. I think it was several of the speakers talked about building community, and getting together with your neighbors and planting trees is a great community builder. And then you've got those trees to plant flowers around and string lights on in the winter, and it really just helps to make a city into a hometown. And I think that's really cool and important.
So perhaps we might hear from either Stefan or Amy, and then if there are any questions in the audience.
Amy, am I allowed to go first?
Yes, sure.
Thanks a lot. Yes, thank you. Now, I would just like to add, or to say it differently, I can't add really in the same way as you do, because you are really much more working on the ground than me as an academic. But what I would perhaps like to add as a kind of perspective is that we also need to when I talk about cooperation and participation, of course, it's with the people on the ground. That's quite clear. And I don't want to go into that. But it's also really much more building these, say, communities of practice of those that are doing, the experts somewhere, they're sitting somewhere. That's for me, it's really crucial also. And so I said this already in my talk. So it's the hydrologists, or the water engineers, I should say, those that are working on transport is really crucial, because we don't get one single tree into the city of Munich if not a car park disappears. Yeah, that's simply like that. And then you have, of course, also the people immediately, because they are owning the cars and they need it, maybe or maybe not. So this complex. And a city like Munich has a wonderful machine of administration. It's huge and it's rich, but to bring these different sectors together, that's a tremendous challenge, I think. And behind that's also something which becomes increasingly clear to me, is there is all this stuff that you as practitioners know quite well, of regulations, laws, and so on. And if we don't cut through that Gordic knot somehow, to define water not as wastewater when it runs off a street, but to allow it to infiltrate or to be used for irrigating the garden or so. These are the big challenges for me behind. So that needs to be addressed.
I would just add that my organization works with Rutgers quite a bit, but on diesel reduction issues and at EOSHI. And that partnership, between academics and community people is very challenging, because a lot of academics, they don't want to be advocates. They just want to be scientists, right? And how do you be a scientist and maintain the integrity of your work in the way that you need to, but also be helpful to community groups? And I think that's, one thing that we're just going to have to keep navigating, all the time. And community people can be incredible experts. They may never have gone to college, but they can learn this stuff, if they have people, if they're either motivated enough or they have people to help them and partner with somebody like an academic institution or somebody who knows this stuff. I think it's just, important. I never thought about the parking lot underground. I have family in the Netherlands, and they, there's a lot of stuff going on underneath the ground, and yet they're completely full of water, right? So, I never thought about that, but you did, and you had to consider that. So if we actually shared our knowledge in ways that was, helpful to each other, we might actually come up with better solutions by working together, as opposed to working in the silos that we do.
Absolutely. And I really appreciate that point of looking to the community as actually expert in their own way. They are the experts of community. So questions in the audience, or I don't see anything in the chat. Oh, let's see. Anybody in the room here?
Hello, everyone. I just, after looking at Frank's presentation and seeing how a lot of these spaces are, of course, fill and you want to absorb the water, I think you should try growing trees or other plants that require a lot of water so they could definitely suck the water up. And there's not a lot of standing water. And it kind of, you got great oxygen and then you're sucking the plants up, oak trees, or old willow oak trees, different plants, ferns, So in planting these trees in places where there's lots of water, I think you could kill two birds with one stone. But I wanted to ask you, how do you deal with municipally about when you are growing these trees and it starts to buckle up the concrete? Is there a deal where they go in and fix it, or, make a better space for it, or control the roots better?
So that's a great question and a real problem. And to my knowledge, that the project that I talked about has no extending, no way of dealing with that. I think that project was about planting the trees. Every town works with that differently. Some municipalities put that responsibility on the adjacent homeowner, and some take the responsibility onto the municipality through taxes. And so a lot of the municipalities, I work with shade tree commissions across New Jersey, and helping them come up with plans for that and ordinances and ways to use. A lot of towns that maybe have a tree planting fund, that's built on development, or you take down a tree, you have to get a permit and put money into that fund, making sure that fund is not just for tree planting, but for maintenance or to help with sidewalk issues. And with that project that I was talking about, some of the research that we're excited about doing over the next couple of summers with the interns is finding out, what species are doing better than others, and which ones are buckling the sidewalk, and how much room is producing a good, strong, healthy tree. And so using that to, as everybody talked about, we don't plant trees, but we have to do it in a smart way, and oriented to capture efficiencies in terms of shading and stormwater management. So I'm completely on board with finding out what's the best species, and let's diversity is important in to be resilient against insect and disease, but also you want to put the right tree in the right place. So so that's another thing that the Forest Service is providing grant funding for, not just planting trees, but also taking up concrete and putting underground, connecting the tree pits with soil, a structural soil underneath, and planting more than just the tree in that tree pit, putting, like you said, other plants there to do more in terms of stormwater management. So all those things are, in process, but maybe we're going to speed that process, right?
Yes, the question about creating more of a full ecosystem, right? That system. So, Will.
So Pam, in your opinion, and I know you probably have this asked frequently, I've been in the retail business too, so it might be a bit of a painful question. What is your go-to shade tree for urban areas? I know it's subjective and a bit complicated, but in your opinion.
So I have to do it depends, and I never will give just one tree, because I think it's so important to plant a diversity of trees and match the tree to the site and make sure we're not just planting the one. There is no bulletproof tree. So we have to, be diverse. There's a whole list of trees that do really, really well in urban areas. And so we have to be pulling from that list as the space provides. I'm sorry, I'm sure that's not a satisfying answer, but that's my answer.
So thank you, Pam. And I do have one question to pull from the chat here. So this is coming from Christina, and her question is for Amy. She says, I've read a bit about the Adopt a Lot program in Newark, and the idea seems ripe for embracing the existing societal and cultural infrastructure. One point that was made in the article I read was that the most successful lot conversions were inhabited by all of the people in the community, including what many people would consider undesirable activity, drug sales, etc. In your experience, is this true? And does the city of Newark consider those sites a failure?
No. Well, there's, the city of Newark has an urban garden program, and some of them are run by groups like the Ironbound Community Corporation that have been around for 50 years, and they both grow and sell and give away food and train people to be gardeners and to do urban farming. There's another there's actually another sort of group of gardens where they adopted lots from the city, and they all have gardens. And one of the more successful or highlighted ones is Rabbit Hole Garden. This is a place where we built kiosks and picket fences, and they have a whole program there. I mean, they have music and poetry reading, and it's right next to a school, so kids come next door and they get some green beans out of the garden as they're going home. I mean, it's kind of made it into a cultural hub. And I think one of the challenges is how to keep these lots in the public domain and in the community. And the Rabbit Hole Garden has been there for a long time, and I hope never goes away. In fact, they took a lot over next door and expanded, and the mayor's been there many times. And we just want to keep seeing more of those things as opposed to losing them. And I think in part it comes from having an activist mayor. Mayor Baraka is a very activist-oriented mayor, as opposed to somebody who's just, has a developer in mind. So I think it makes a big difference.
Great. Thank you so much. And I do see the time. So we have arrived and actually surpassed 4:30 by a minute. But I wanted to thank all of our panelists one more time for this really interesting look. And then I also want to invite you all to either here in person, join us back in the Livingston Hall, or those of you participating online, the panel for Zoom room for some closing comments that I believe Frank Gallagher will be delivering. So I will see you all in there. Thank you.